Georgia plays Texas in the Sugar Bowl tomorrow because this is going out Friday afternoon. Make sure you're watching this before the game. Dogs and Longhorns in Atlanta. Let's talk about the playoff scenarios for Georgia. Ryan Curley from Dawg Post talking to you about what I think are the three. There's no other options. There's three different things that can happen for Georgia. Obviously, there are variations of these three main things depending on how the cards fall this weekend, depending on how these conference championships go. But there are three possibilities for Georgia in terms of how this playoff can go. All right? And let's talk about the first one, which is the simplest one. Georgia beating Texas in the SEC championship. What does that mean for the Dogs? It means they're going to be one of the top four conference champions that earns a playoff bye. And in this case, I think Georgia will be ranked number 2. Not as important for the conversation. There's a second part of the conversation we'll get to about that, but not for this part of it. And the main part of this one is, they would get that bye and they would automatically go to the Sugar Bowl for the quarterfinals, which would be 8 teams left at that point. That's the simplest thing that Georgia could do is just beat Texas and go to the Sugar Bowl. You know what's going on. And in that case, Georgia would not have to play in that first round. That's the bye that they get. They don't have to play in the first round of the playoffs, which would be like the December 20th, 21st games, and those would be the on-campus games, right? So that first round is the on-campus. For some of you, I'm not spewing secrets. For some of you, I'm explaining things, so just follow along, and I'm going to talk about what each of these scenarios would mean for Georgia, how difficult it would be. So that's the simplest one. And obviously, the situation that's the best because they don't have to play in the first round game. They don't have to play an extra football game. They're eliminating a football game by winning the SEC championship and going on to go ahead to that round of 8 teams. And it'd be really easy. You know where you're going. It's a place that I don't think any of the players on this team would have. I don't think any of the players on this team would have went to the Sugar Bowl. I think we're past that point now. Maybe someone from the 9 team. It might have been Xavier Truss, but my point is it's been a while since Georgia's been in the Sugar Bowl. 18 and 19, that's when they went. But a place that they're familiar with in terms of a program, obviously Kirby Smart and some of those coaches, and a situation where geographically it's not the worst case scenario, right? The best case scenario geographically would be somehow Georgia getting into the Peach Bowl, which is a possibility maybe. It gets a little cloudier, and there's like all sorts of scenarios you'd have to talk about with the rankings. But like I said, the easiest one is just winning and going on and playing in that first round. Newsletter. It's down below. I didn't have a creative way to pump it, to tell you guys about it, but just make sure you're looking at it. I have it linked in the description of this video. It's one of the easiest ways to support Dawg Post. If you like the content on here, if you like the website, if you haven't heard of the website, it's a great way to get familiarized with it. It's the written form of Dawg Post. That's all it is. There's a message board, but the newsletter is free. All you got to do is put your email in that link, and you'll see it, easy to follow. And then every day in your inbox, you get notifications. Hey, this is what's going on with Georgia. It's one of the best ways to stay in the loop. If you're a Georgia fan, you want to be a smarter Georgia fan, as Dean would say. Okay, what is scenario number 2? And this is kind of the way I've ranked the scenarios. Obviously, that's the best case in terms of what could happen this weekend. Second thing, they lose to Texas, right? And in these next 2 scenarios I'm talking about, it involves Georgia losing to Texas. There was only one where it involved them beating Texas. So this one, you've got a loss, which there are a couple different things that can happen with it. So let's say it's this thing. We don't really know how the committee is going to view the conference championships. We don't know because it's a new committee. We saw a year ago Georgia lost in the SEC championship after being ranked number 1 or 2. They lose, they drop, and they fell out of the 14 playoff. Even though a lot of people felt Georgia was one of the 4 best teams, but it just didn't win its conference championship. It lost on the wrong day, right? So is that going to happen this year? If Georgia loses to Texas, if Texas loses to Georgia, is that team going to get punished in the rankings by more than, dropping a couple spots? I get it if they drop a spot or 2 and they want to rearrange things. But so the second scenario is Georgia loses to Texas and they don't drop in the rankings and they still have a home playoff game. Seeds 5 through, it's dumb, but seeds 5 through 8 will get the home playoff game. In this current scenario, which I will go ahead and pull up for you guys so you can take a look at this. In this scenario, right, you can see this is kind of an idea of what could happen. Over here, Georgia being the 7th seed, right? If they lose to Texas and maybe playing against Indiana, it could end up that Georgia ends up having a rematch against Tennessee, having a matchup against Ohio State. Teams like that are the ones that Georgia would probably end up playing. Alabama's probably a less likely situation. Alabama might not make this thing, but that would what it would look like if Georgia doesn't get punished for losing and they lost. Maybe a home game against a team like Indiana. A home rematch against Tennessee would not be the most ideal situation, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. Georgia would be favored at home against pretty much any of these teams, right? So that's kind of the scenario there. Now, what is the bad scenario, I guess, the worst case scenario of the three things I've talked about? So we talked about Georgia getting a home playoff game if it loses to Texas. We talked about Georgia getting a bye in the playoff. But what happens if the committee says, you know what, we're going to punish these conference championship losers? Georgia, you lost to Texas. Oregon, you lost to Penn State, or vice versa, or however it works. And we're going to drop these guys in the playoffs. What happens in that case? So let's say Georgia ends up being the 9 seed, and you saw what that bracket looked like a minute ago. It's going to be a road playoff game if they end up 9 through 12. And it will depend on how things shake out with the Clemson-SMU game. That complicates things the most. The SMU-Clemson game probably has the biggest implications in terms of how these teams are going to be ranked at the end of the day. But in this third scenario, Georgia's got to go on the road. And that's obviously not ideal. When you just 2 weeks prior lost a big game against Texas in the SEC Championship, that would be the case in this situation. Georgia, if you're Georgia, you don't want to go up to Knoxville and play a rematch up in their place. You don't want that to happen. You don't want to go to Columbus or Bloomington if it ends up. I don't know how Indiana could end up ranked ahead of Georgia, but I guess it's possible. Going to Notre Dame if they have Notre Dame ranked low enough. You don't want to go to these cold environments. One, I don't want to, right? Because I'm going to go too. If wherever they go, I'm going. But it's just not ideal going on the road. Like that's the simplest way to put it. Georgia be favored. It's pretty much all these teams in Sanford Stadium. But I don't know if that's the case up in Columbus and up in Knoxville. And I wouldn't feel great about that. For Georgia, I wouldn't. And it would be a tough situation. And the problem with all this is obviously the buys and the way that the buys are. The fact that the Boise could get a bye, or Arizona State could maybe get a bye. SMU, teams that didn't have to go through as much. It's hard to judge college football when it's not all apples to apples, and it's especially harder to judge it when we put together a system like this that makes things complicated and doesn't reward certain things that probably need to be rewarded. And Georgia could end up getting the short end of the stick with things here. So I actually think that this situation where Georgia ends up on the road is the least likely. Obviously, Georgia could lose to Texas. I don't know. I think Georgia's going to win, but I don't know. All right, I thought Georgia was going to lose the first time. This time I think it's going to win. Maybe that means it's going to be the opposite of what I think. But you just don't want to go on the road. And then here's the other part of it. And real quick, this is one of the concerns. These rankings could end up to where, so the 7 and the 10 seed, that game, they play the 2 seed. Well, the winner of the SEC Championship is likely going to be the 2 seed, depending on what happens in the Big Ten Championship, but likely is going to end up being the 2 seed. So the 7 and the 10 matchup in the first round ends up playing the 2 seed. And if that's Georgia or Texas could easily end up being the 7 seed. I think the committee would manipulate it to where that matchup couldn't happen, but we can't say that for sure. We definitely can't say that for sure. So I think that definitely would be an issue if all of a sudden you're seeing a Georgia-Texas rematch in the Sugar Bowl 3 weeks after they just battled it out in Atlanta. It's a flaw that could happen here. It's a flaw that could happen for Ohio State and Penn State potentially if they decide to tweak these rankings afterwards. I don't think it's an ideal situation. I don't know what you'll learn if these teams have to play each other 3 times, 2 times. I just don't know what you're learning in that situation. Obviously, if the same team wins all those, you're learning something. But in that case, I think it'd be a problem. But those are the scenarios for Georgia winning the SEC championship this weekend and going to the Sugar Bowl is obviously what you want if you're Georgia. All right, newsletter is linked down below. Ryan Coder from Dawg Post. Thanking you for watching this show.